which is your dominant reflex? It's a bit like, are you left-handed or right-handed, right? And it may not always be the same one in every situation, but I do have clients who tend to more avoid conflict with their peers and others who tend to escalate it, right? Mm-hmm. And each time that happens, the power dynamic shifts and other people's reflexes get activated. So being able to identify what your reflex is, if you will, I think is a very useful skill.
Welcome to You Might Try This, a podcast about learning how to lead without losing yourself along the way. Hosted by executive coaches Stacey, Philpot, and Cade, Cowan. This show draws on 25 years of experience working with high-level leaders and brings those lessons down to earth. If you're navigating leadership for the first time, managing people, questioning old rules, and trying to build a career that actually feels good, you're in the right place. This is You Might Try This. Honest leadership advice for ambitious people who still want to sleep at night.
So welcome back to You Might Try This. Last week, we talked about the taxes that accrue every time you delay the conversation that needs to happen. And I want to pick up where we left off because sometimes even the knowledge of what we should do doesn't allow us to do the thing that we need to do. Stacey, I remember when I ran leadership development for Coca-Cola, I had put in a number of kind of globally sanctioned programs, if you will. And one was on difficult conversations. And I remember one of my colleagues from a different part of the world, he called me once and he said, Cade, we need to have a conversation on difficult conversations. And I said, well, in fact, we have one. We've already rolled it out. And he said, oh, I know, but people still aren't having difficult conversations. So
you didn't solve it? You didn't solve it with that one program? Right?
No, this is for those people that had the course, they had the program, but they still just can't seem to stop avoiding the hard conversations.
I think what trips people up a lot is they're like, okay, I know what to do. Delaying hard conversations is expensive. I just need more courage, more willpower. I'm going to do it. And I like to tell my clients, listen, there are a lot of things I know, right, that I could do, right? If I want to lose weight, I know that I need to exercise. And that's really different than getting up every day and doing it, right?
Yes.
So knowledge isn't always enough, but also willpower isn't really enough, right? Because if people then tell themselves that the answer is willpower and they don't do it, then they just feel bad about themselves.
That's right.
So
which is exactly,
yeah.
That's right. And that's exactly backwards from what we want. So today we're going to be looking at answering the question that actually matters, which is, why does it keep happening even when you know the cost, even when you know that this is not creating an advantage? And the short answer is that the avoidance isn't a decision always. It's actually, most often, it's a reflex.
I think that's a great distinction because it helps people kind of feel more comfortable and realize all of us, a lot of times, our behavior runs on reflexes. So we want to try to understand them, right? And know about them and make conscious decisions when we can, but just trying harder isn't always helpful advice for anyone, right? Working with a reflex, that's something we can talk about.
Yeah. So let's talk about what's actually happening. You know, we touched on Naomi Eisenberger's research in our episode on feedback. So she's the neuroscientist at UCLA who ran the fMRI studies that showed that the brain processes social conflict using the same neural pathways as physical pain. So the same region, it's the same, anterior cingulate cortex, same activation.
So it's amazing because that means that when tension shows up in a conversation, right? When someone says something that upsets you, doesn't land right? Or you need to tell someone something you think is going to upset them, your brain is not calmly evaluating and preparing for that conversation. They are already classifying it as a threat, like physical pain. And then they start running a threat protocol, if you will.
Yeah.
Right? That's what your brain does.
Yeah, exactly. And that protocol is pretty much standard across the human population. So your brain's deciding, do I avoid? Do I appease or do I attack? Those are kind of the three factory settings, if you will. And Stacey, fascinatingly, when Eisenberger and her collaborator, in this case, a collaborator worked with her on this particular research, they found that Tylenol, like actual over-the-counter acetaminophen, measurably reduced the emotional pain of social rejection because the biology is that literal. I just want to say we're not giving medical advice on the episode.
That is amazing, though, isn't it? Yeah, we're not telling everyone to take Tylenol before their performance conversations, but if you think about it, that avoid, appease, attack is the fight, flight, or freeze, right? So when we think about a physical attack, people say, "Oh, it's a fight, flight, or freeze."
And appease, I've heard as well. I've heard people take the three factory settings to four, but nonetheless, the behavior's pretty much the
correct.
same.
And so what we're thinking about is, feelings getting hurt is like a physical pain. And that means we respond to the perception that we're going to be emotionally hurt similarly, right? And that's pretty significant. I don't think people think about that at work. There's a lot of like, well, it's just your feelings are hurt, but our bodies process it in a similar manner.
Yeah. So we have to reframe it though, because biology is not destiny. The reflex is very much real. It's automatic. It's happening. It's firing before you've even had a single conscious thought about the situation. But that doesn't mean that you're stuck with whatever it produces. It just means you've got to get upstream of that moment, get ahead of the trigger. And that's what we want to talk about today.
That's great. So let's talk about those factory settings, right? The kind of threat protocols we run, the avoid, appease, or attack. Let's talk about what does that look like in practice? Because what I find is most people have sort of a default setting they go to most of the time, and they don't think about it that way.
And an easier way to think about this is, rather than kind of the three factory settings, just think of it as like, let's collapse it into a binary. So there are basically two poles. One pole is silence. You go quiet or you smooth it over, you defer, you change the subject, make a joke, find a reason to come back to it. All of that rests on the silence end of the spectrum. But then on the other end of the pole is escalation. An escalation, like you can go cold. That almost sounds like silence. But have you ever been in the room where somebody goes cold and it's clearly aggression? So they can go cold or they can get very sharp or get defensive. They dig in, making it personal, shutting the conversation. Like they come back aggressively and almost emboldened in a way that, they turn that heat up. So it shuts the conversation down. So that's kind of like the two ends of the spectrum.
Well, what's interesting is when people take that response, what we learn as humans is if we have that dominant reflex over time, we become reinforced for it. So if I, for example, have a situation, it's stressful, and I remove myself, I get cold, and then I see that the situation resolves. I've learned, that actually worked well. It's good to avoid things. If I give it, if I pull back, other people will handle it. That is a successful approach to resolving conflict, right? I handled it well. Likewise, if someone's more direct, right? They want to go towards the conflict rather than away from it. And it works. They've escalated it. They think, okay, I've handled it directly. That worked well. We moved on. So these reflexes become reinforced the more we use them, especially if we don't use the other ones and think about how it could have been. We don't know what we could have done from our choices.
And neither of those is actually conflict engagement or conflict management. Both of those, the avoider or the aggressor, it's a form of conflict escape, if you will. That's the thing. Silence on one hand, escalation on the other. They're kind of like they're both exits, just different doors, so to speak. But it is a way away from the actual management of the conflict itself.
And those reflexes, the kind of damage they do, tends to be different as well, right? So the leader who defaults to silence, let's say, the avoider, right? I think what their teams learn is to stop bringing them real problems because everyone just sort of knows that it will be avoided or it won't work well. And that becomes dangerous because if you do that as a leader, you stop losing access to important information and you've basically trained your team to self-censor. They're not going to bring you upsetting information. And
Right.
you are losing access to data that could inform your decisions that you need to make as part of your job.
Yeah, and that's on the silent side. And then, on the escalation side, I would say the damage is different, but equally bad. Teams learn just not to surface problems. Just like the first team, but this team, they're not surfacing problems because of very different reason. And that's not because nothing happens, but it's because something happens that they don't want to be in the room for. It can be volatile. There can be temper involved. It can be intimidating.
So here's the question I think it's useful for people to consider is, which is your dominant reflex? It's a bit like, are you left-handed or right-handed, right? And it may not always be the same one in every situation, but I do have clients who tend to more avoid conflict with their peers and others who tend to escalate it, right? And each time that happens, the power dynamic shifts and other people's reflexes get activated. So being able to identify what your reflex is, if you will, I think is a very useful skill.
Yes. And I think it's a really important observation that we have to think contextually here, because that dominant reflex is often contextual or situational. It's not just a personality type. It's often more of the relationship type. What is my relationship to this person with whom I appear to be in conflict? And how is that triggering my moving from one end of the spectrum to the other? So part of doing this work is getting granular enough to know with whom do I go quiet and with whom do I go hard. I mean, Stacey, in all honesty, sometimes if I think about the people that I go hard with, just self-disclosure, I'm not proud of this, but I know it now and I think about it. But, a lot of times we go hard with people that we assume a difference in status, perhaps. That customer service agent that perhaps is nameless, faceless. So there's some anonymity involved, or we somehow, I hate to say it, but we perceive a status differential. Sometimes I'll go hard there. And then upon reflection, I think that makes me a shitty person. So I have to then think about that and change my tone, or at least be somewhat consistent, more consistent, probably sharing too much, but just that always triggers me because it's self-recognition there,
Yeah, I know that I tend to lean into more of an escalation reflex when I feel that different triggers pull for different things. So if I feel disrespected by someone, I tend to escalate it as I believe it's standing up for myself, if you will, even though it may not always be an effective way to do it, or I may do it too aggressively. I feel disrespected, so I'm going to escalate and go direct, right? And there are other times where I pick my battles a little bit more and can avoid it if I'm worried more that I'm going to lose the relationship. So different contexts for me pull for different tactics.
Yes. I think another thing that triggers me into like aggression is like gross incompetence. You get an email. I got an email from a customer service agent on something where clearly they'd not even read the email that I sent, and it was a pat response. And, again, so just understanding what triggers, your ends of the pole, silence or aggression, I think really important. And then you mentioned context as well, just the context of the relationship. Say more about that, Stacey.
Well, you have different triggers often pull for different behaviors. And one of the things I do with teams is I ask people on the team to think about what triggers them, right? You just mentioned incompetence, right? I talked about feeling disrespected. Those would be things that trigger an emotional reaction and a conflict response frequently. So I ask people on teams, think about what triggers you. What do you tend to look like under stress? How would other people describe your behavior? And what helps you recenter, right? Each of those things is important on a team because often what causes difficult dynamics on a team is when people are using those conflict reflexes because they've been upset about something. And then it causes someone else to have it, and then it becomes a spiral. So if I feel you're disrespecting me, I come at you a little bit and escalate it. You then look at me and think, Stacey's not handling this professionally or competently. You get triggered and you have your response. And all of a sudden there now becomes a dynamic over time that is quite difficult on the team.
Yeah. And think about the misunderstanding that can create, Stacey, because let's say you're aggressive and I'm more silent. So you come at me and I'm figuring out, how do I get out of the room, not have this conversation? You may think problem solved, but I showed him, I'm walking away like, I'll show her.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Exactly. So learning that these reflexes, what I tell clients is how you respond to stress is just part of being a human. It's not something you can fix. It's not a bug. It's not going to go away, but you can be mindful of it. And you can learn to see that when someone else is exhibiting a behavior that seems like an escalation or a conflict response, that it means they're having a difficult time.
Yeah. And I think we have to be humble in this conversation and saying, look, we're talking about conflict management styles. We can't scratch the surface on this in 25 minutes, obviously. But I do believe that understanding kind of what my dominant pattern is under what situations and with whom, how that changes as the context changes, I think very important. You've got to know your reflex across the relationships. There's likely not a general tendency. Don't let someone with a personality assessment under their arm tell you that you have one style inside of conflict. Not true. So with that being said, here's where I'd like to go next, because I think this is the layer that actually can help people create some traction. The reflex isn't random. It's actually protecting something. And when you understand what you're protecting, then you get a little bit more leverage.
So say more about that. What are the things you think the response can protect, Cade, for example?
Yeah, sure. So, the reflex was built for a reason. So many of these things are biological or at least sociological. So avoiders are typically protecting something relational. So the relationship or the other person's feelings or harmony of the room, their own sense of being liked and approved of, maybe their own sense of others perceiving them as competent. Those aren't bad things to care about. So the problem isn't the value there. The problem is that the reflex is protecting the short-term version of the relationship at the expense of the long-term. So you may be wanting to exit right now. That feels right. That's the value you could create in the short term. But by exiting, not engaging in the conflict, you're actually putting the long-term viability of the relationship or the work to be delivered or the purpose, you're putting that in harm's way, let's say.
So when seeing people who are doing that, the conversation with them tends to be, I know you believe you're protecting the relationship, but in the long run, you aren't, right? And what can you do now that will help you maintain that relationship, but bring a little bit more honesty? And how much of you avoiding the conversation is protecting your own comfort versus committing into the relationship?
Mm-hmm. We've talked about it before, and that's not to be terribly negative, but we humans are selfish creatures, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
And so often it is about our need in the moment. And we're also short-term survival instincts, with survival instincts, I should say. And so oftentimes the short term comes at the expense of the long term. So anyway, that's kind of like for those that navigate in certain contexts with certain people toward the silence end. But if you think about the escalators, their reflex is protecting something different. And that's usually self-image, the need to be right, the need to be in control. I'd said competence earlier on the silence side, but honestly, competence is oftentimes what the aggressor is trying to protect as well. So escalators go hard because going quiet feels like losing. And we've seen those people. They are going to wade in to the conflict. They are not holding back in certain contexts.
Well, that threat is, so if avoiders are afraid of losing the relationship, but escalators or the escalating, I don't want to say it like a person, like it's a personality style, but the approach of escalating is when someone feels disrespected or that they might lose how they perceive themselves or how they think other people perceive them.
Exactly.
It's a different approach.
That's right. It's usually self-image. Remember, what was that line that We don't actually see our self-image isn't constructed how we see ourselves. It's what I think you think I am. We covered that a couple of podcasts back, and that's what's getting threatened when people go into that aggressor mode.
Yes. And this happens when our leadership identity is fragile. So think about what happens when we're transitioning into a new job or under a difficult time at work, layoffs are coming, or there's a merger or acquisition, there's some transition, or you're feeling that your job is changing, or you might lose part of your leadership identity, right? So when you're still figuring out who you are as a leader, you may have an even more exaggerated response, right, to these kinds of things.
So this kind of brings us to a practical question, which is, once you know what your reflex is protecting, either on the silent side or the aggressor side, what do you do with that? And I can tell you the answer is not to stop the reflex, or not to try to stop the reflex, because it's reflexive. That's almost never going to work. So you have to start addressing, what's underneath that.
And so for the avoider, what that means is believing that the relationship is strong enough that it can tolerate having a hard conversation, trusting that you can have a hard enough conversation and maintain the relationship. For the escalator, the person who's using an escalating reflex, it means building enough sense of confidence or security in your own identity that another person can't take that away and they aren't making a judgment on you.
Mm-hmm. And both of those, let's be honest, easier said than done. These things don't happen overnight, but they all do happen with the same first move. And that's simply naming what you're protecting, out loud to yourself before the moment arrives, name what you're protecting. So with that kind of brings us to what you might actually try in the spirit of, you might try this. So,
all right. Experiment time, Cade. What are you thinking?
Look, on this episode, you and I arrived at a conclusion, which is one thing, not a list, but this episode is really about getting upstream of the moment, getting ahead of the trigger. And so this experiment's designed to help you get ahead of the trigger.
I love that because when you're already in that reflex, you're acting and you're down the road. So getting upstream from it gives you choices.
Yes. And willpower, we know, is a really awful tool when your threat response is already firing, kind of akin to don't go grocery shopping when you're hungry.
Don't give someone feedback when you're mad at them, right? Yeah.
Right. I'm hungry right now, Stacey. That's why that one example came to mind. So here's the experiment. Identify the conflict that you've been avoiding, which is the conversation that needs to happen. And before you have it, name the reflex out loud or in writing if you need to. Just say, my instinct here is going to be to go quiet or go cold. And what I'm trying to protect is fill in the blank.
Okay, and that's it.
I might say,
just write it down.
I'm about to have a conversation with Stacey. I'm really afraid that because I was late on producing that particular report, she's going to think I don't care. And I am just going to go quiet. I'm going to hear her out. And hopefully the conversation will go faster than I want it to go. Like, name it.
And that's it. Just name it, write it down. This is what I'm trying to protect.
That's the first part.
Okay,
that's the first part. And then the second part is then making one small commitment about what you're going to do instead. It's not a script, not a whole strategy, just like one thing. Like, I'm going to stay in the room, even if I want to leave. Or I'm going to wait 3 seconds before I respond. So you name it, you name what you're going to notice about yourself, and then you anchor you decide to do the opposite, right? So that pre-commitment beats in the moment willpower every time. I'll give you a very quick story. Remember, Stacey, before COVID, when we actually had things like conference calls and we weren't on videos all the time?
Yes.
I used to, in one of my jobs, I'd come up with these leadership development designs. And then, I was corporate in that role, and I would attempt to sell them in to some of the global affiliates. And I hated conference calls because in conference calls, I felt like I would put my work forward, and then it was everybody's opportunity to tell me what was wrong about that work.
That's always fun. We love that. The firing squad. Yes.
And in that context, I could be aggressive. I knew that. And so I had one simple little rule, which was when the feedback started coming in, I would only answer them with questions. Tell me more about that. What, as you say that? Blah, blah, blah. It was like forcing me to be more curious as opposed to, well, let me tell you why we're doing this. Because all I was doing then was provoking defensiveness on their part. So then that went nowhere. But that was an example. I just said, I'll only answer their feedback with questions. I don't have to address their concerns with a statement in the moment.
How did you get to the realization that asking questions was better?
Well, I can tell you, because making statements wasn't getting me anywhere. No, you know what it actually was doing for me, Stacey? Because it would aggravate me. I don't mind saying I'm low affective, as they say. I can get triggered pretty easily. So I was getting aggravated. And so what I found was that by asking questions and getting curious, it was in some ways disguising my annoyance. And then honestly, sometimes I'd ask questions, there'd be really good responses. And so suddenly the annoyance went away and I just got interested in what they had to say. And so that was instructive for me. I used a version of that. I use a version of that all the time.
Mm-hmm. That's fabulous. I really like what you've suggested earlier, which is working to identify what are you trying to protect, right? So I know that sometimes you might have more of the avoidance reflex, and I tend to have the escalation reflex.
I gave you an example of escalation, but you're right. And you know me well enough. In general, I'm an avoider.
Mm-hmm. And when I've started to think about when I'm doing that, wait, what am I protecting? And is taking a warrior approach of getting really upset and being directive appropriate, or a more diplomatic approach be better? And what am I trying to protect helps me calm down and get centered on what matters versus being in the emotional trigger. And so I really like asking people to think about when they're upset, what's important to you that be protected? And can you write that down so that it becomes conscious and people can see it and think about it and then say, what's the best way to protect that?
Mm-hmm. And I would say sometimes, I don't know about you, but I find that when I write it down and I look at it, it seems a lot smaller than it did when it was just like running rampant in my head.
Yeah, the story in your head gets bigger, right? The more you're thinking about it, and then there's the big story, it gets bigger.
So then you realize you were actually working so hard to protect something that actually wasn't that fragile,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great.
So that's it. So, try it. Pick a conversation that you've been circling the drain on. Name your reflex, name what it's protecting, and then make that commitment about what you're going to do inside of that conflict. And one I learned once, it was actually from Susan Scott, who we've mentioned before. Let silence do the heavy lifting, so sometimes rather than just being ready to go, got to have a response. That's a great one. Let silence do the heavy lifting. Sit there in the awkwardness of the silence and see what transpires. That's another one. If it works for you based on your reflex, and then just see what happens.
I love it. Well, next week, we're going to talk about not just styles or parts of conversations. We're going to talk about a relationship. And we're going to talk about the relationship that has more impact on your relationship trajectory than almost anything else. And that's your boss. So we're going to talk about how do you build the most important relationship in your career while still being true to yourself, authentic, and doing it in a way that works for you. And I look forward to having that conversation with you, Cade. So we'll see everyone
that's going to be a fun one. Same here.
It is.
All right, Stacey, thank you. Thanks to everybody for being with us. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to You Might Try This, brought to you by EDC and Edgewise Media. To learn more about the podcast, visit youmightTryThis.com or connect with us on social media.